Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we will discuss the state of Germany's post-election politics, including efforts to reform the country's fiscal rules and upcoming coalition talks. We also cover the latest European Council meeting where European security and Ukraine were a top priority, and I will share some of my impressions from visiting Brussels and Paris last week. Then we will turn to a conversation with the great Phil Luck, director of the CSIS Economics Program and Scholl Chair in International Business, to discuss a looming transatlantic trade fight. We hope you enjoyed the show. Then at the end, big week in Europe last week. We had huge announcements from the upcoming German government that is going to try to take action in typical American fashion in the lame duck period, because all Americans know that the only way to get things done is to do it after the election when half the people are leaving and never going to be in power again. So what is happening in Germany?
Huge indeed. And actually, making moves in the lame duck period is quite unusual for Europeans and for Germans.
Yes, because normally you have functioning governments.
And the turnaround time to get to the new Bundestag is not that long. So that's the big focus right now. So basically, here's what we heard out of Berlin from the incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The discussions between his party and the center-left SPD. Biggest announcement in years is they are looking at relaxing the debt brake for a variety of expenses. But basically, in short, what this means is the baseline currently for the debt brake means that the structural deficit for the government cannot be more than 0.35% of GDP. That is basically no deficit. Now, what they're looking at is any defense expenditure above 1% of GDP would be exempt from the debt brake. That's a response to the war in Ukraine, to the United States generally moving away from guaranteeing European security. There's also an announcement around a 500 billion euro special fund for infrastructure projects that would be outside the normal budgetary spending. Those are massive, massive investments. 500 billion euros, which I think is probably about $600 billion, something like that, maybe a little less than that these days. These are massive moves. And it also is surprising to some extent because during the campaign, Merz and the CDU had promised that that would not happen.
I don't know if he promised. There was some winking.
We kind of knew something was going to happen, but he didn't say, I'm going to make massive changes to how Germany has managed its budget for the last 20 years. Now, the reason he's doing it before the new Bundestag comes in, which is March 25th, that's the deadline basically, is that he currently has the majority he needs in the parliament, which is 2/3, to update the constitution to put that in there. Once the new Bundestag comes in, he'll be just short of it. And that'll be much harder to find the right coalition to pass these changes.
Well, he'll be just short of it with the CDU, SPD, the Greens. He would need Die Linke. Die Linke is against the debt brake.
Yes. The concessions that they would want to get out of this are much more complicated than if it's just the Greens and SPD voting for this. So that's where we are. There are some questions around whether that kind of move in the quote-unquote lame duck period is constitutional. It also needs to pass 2/3 of the Senate, the Bundesrat. So, it's not the easiest path, but it is easier now than with the next Bundestag.
What I would say is just get it done. And get it done now, move fast. And I think there's going to be some haggling between the CDU and the Greens. I mean, the Greens are a little bit like, wait a second, why didn't we do this 2 years ago when the CDU were sort of swearing by the...
Because lo and behold, they were in the opposition.
Yes, exactly. And so, I think the Greens are going to try to extract a pound of flesh, and I think the CDU should, in some ways give it to them. It's the honorable thing to do, I would say. And so I think I just have to imagine that there will be a deal done. Let's just assume it happens. I mean, this is, I think, hugely transformational. This is Germany getting out the fiscal bazooka that they had buried, deep down in a concrete bunker and then had poured concrete to seal it all off. And then they've chiseled it out, pulled it out, and are about to fire it. And it is going to make the German economy hum again. I mean, that is, I think, just quite clear that Germany desperately needs this investment. Economists are very excited about this.
Yeah, we already see this in the projections.
And, I think the person that's not going to be excited about this is Vladimir Putin, because I think the nightmare for Russia is to have a very strong German army. And that's what this is pointing to. And so I think this is hugely impactful. It's also maybe to turn to Europe. There was big announcements from the European Council. Ursula von der Leyen announced announced a package that effectively added up to around 800 billion. There's some, creative accounting there. Effectively, what it is, 150 billion in EU loans that would then facilitate and basically incentivize countries to start buying together. And so what the other 650 billion would essentially be that countries could spend more on defense, but it wouldn't be counted towards their stability and growth pact, sort of be exempted from the debt rules. But there's no guarantee that countries would actually take the EU up on that. It'd have to depend on the country. It'd be sort of difficult for France and others. But the hope is that this generates more national spending, and that national spending is then done in a coordinated European way. And I think what we've seen and what I saw in Brussels is there's been a lot of discussion about how Europe spends more on defense, a lot of thinking about it. I still think you should do the straight up Euro bonds, and I think that's probably the next step, and I think we may get there. And so Europe is sort of moving fast on the economic front. And so this is earth-changing. This is going to have a huge impact, I think, on global affairs down the road, where Europe is actually going to take its defense very seriously. And the other impression that I got was that there's a real sense that Europe is looking at a post-American future, that U.S.-European relationship is divorcing. The Americans are not interested in us. And the actions that the Trump administration has taken vis-a-vis Ukraine have been really, really, I think, shocking to the Europeans in that it exposes all of their vulnerabilities in the integration of European militaries with U.S. defense systems, and the potential for the U.S. to cut off European forces has meant that when this money is spent, I think it's almost certain that very little of it is going to be spent on U.S. defense companies. And there's going to be a real effort to try to reduce dependence on the U.S. when it comes to defense production and building out and rearming Europe, as Ursula von der Leyen's plan is called, the Rearm Europe plan. And that, I think, it represents a real new dynamic in transatlantic relations.
Oh, 100%. I mean, what we're seeing in Germany and in Europe, to me, are parallel paradigm shifts that are obviously interconnected. Germany announcing that it's ready to do something this big domestically is also a signal that Europe can do more. That also Germany might be open to Europe doing more, because that was also the challenge before. Even if other parts of Europe wanted to move ahead, Germany was a break to something like this. And this is very different. I think the Rearm Europe plan is obviously the opening salvo. There can be changes around this 800 billion figure, but also how it's divided up. President Macron has already said that he thinks 150 billion in loans directly from Europe is too little for what we need. So I'm sure there will be changes on the margins, which there probably should be, but there's some really interesting things in there. One is calling on the European Investment Bank to relax what it can invest in, including in defense. That would really leverage investment potential and potentially pulling in from the private sector as well. We've seen Italy is not on board to use cohesion funds. We'll find other vehicles. The European Union is excellent finding other vehicles to fund things. But also, and related to the work that CSIS and your team has done a lot, is talking about harmonization of requirements in joint procurement, more systematic aggregation of demand. That's what you were saying, is encouraging countries not just to buy more, but to buy better. And that's a huge difference. That's also where you can ensure that a lot of this money doesn't just go to American defense contractors. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily. It's just if you can guarantee to European contractors, this money will come to you if you can produce the same goddamn tank for everyone across the continent. And mostly we'll guarantee that we'll order the same tank across the board. That's a much easier sell with those companies. And you can start really seeing that separation. And I think another thing that was a smart move is immediately after this council meeting, von der Leyen, Costa, and Callas debriefed several non-EU allies. So United Kingdom, Turkey, Canada, Norway, and Iceland. They were on a call on this, agreed to contribute to joint efforts to support Ukraine and defense cooperation. So they're doing the right thing. They're not just doing the EU thing, because that would create some nervousness in some of these partners. They're making sure they're building an alliance outside of the European Union as well, but in the immediate periphery.
Yeah, I think just on that, UK, Norway, Iceland and Norway may in the next 10 years seek to join the European Union. That's not out of the realm of possibility, but all are very close to the EU, even the UK. But Norway is effectively a de facto member paying into the EU budget. So I think whatever the EU does on defense will automatically include Norway. And I think it's critically important that the UK mimic that on defense and security. Maybe not on the other economic issues, but this strikes me as a clear path for the UK-EU relations to improve on defense. The thing that I think is missing, and it's understandable because the Europeans hadn't thought that they were going to be in this situation with Trump. They thought they might be in a tough situation where they're getting beat over the heads about spending more. So there's been a lot of thinking about spending. but they hadn't actually thought that the Americans might just fully leave. And not just that. There's now a concern that the U.S. might actually be more of an adversary, or at least like a Turkey-like ally within NATO. More transactional, but if the United States is trying to build a positive win-win relationship with Russia, that the Europeans see Russia as their main geopolitical foe, as the country that threatens them, as the country that they are all preparing their militaries to deter Russia. And if they see the United States as slightly more on Team Russia than on Team Europe, picking fights with the Europeans while engaging in productive ties with Russia, what does that mean for Europe? And what I think really struck me when I was at NATO headquarters is that the U.S. is likely going to undertake significant troop withdrawals from Europe. That has been pre-planned by many folks in the think tank world that are now in the Trump administration. That is likely going to happen. But no one at NATO is thinking about this. Maybe they're thinking about it at the bar, but they're not planning for it. They're not planning for different scenarios about what do we do if the Americans do X, Y, and Z. And the reason why is because NATO is a consensus-based organization in which the U.S. is fundamental to everything. So everyone is involved in everything. So right now, there is no one in Europe actually thinking about European defense planning. So if the Russians came across the border in Estonia tomorrow and the Americans say, we're not doing anything, Europeans all look around at each other and be like, well, who's the captain? Who's calling the shots? Who is leading this war effort? And so structurally, you have a real problem because NATO is supposed to be Europe's Pentagon. It makes perfect sense. It's a great building. Lots of people work there on European defense. But if it's all consensus-based and the U.S. is there and, hostile to European actions to create a European pillar, and that's part of the reason why there's no European pillar within NATO, the U.S. was always hostile to it. That's a bipartisan thing. How does Europe actually create that? We put out a piece saying it's time to start thinking about a European army. And it was provocative on purpose because what it tried to outline is, okay, how does Europe defend Europe without the United States? First, it starts with not a European army. It starts with the militaries that exist, Germany, France, the UK, the Baltic state militaries, the Finns, others. All of those would still exist. But you need to begin to Europeanize certain aspects. So Europeanizing the things that the US is likely going to take away, the critical enablers, the air tankers, other things like that. The EU can just go, Airbus, we're going to buy some air tankers. We're going to put them in this sort of joint command they have in Eindhoven. And maybe those are EU owned, maybe they're transferred to another country, but the EU could do that. But I think we need to also start thinking about a common European army in the sense that the role the US played is basically as a common European army. Is that the Americans provided this singular military to come in and fight. And you have all this military capacity throughout Europe, not in those major countries, but it's kind of wasted because they're adopting the US military to fight. And I think what you would do is you would just simply begin to recruit soldiers from across the European Union. You give countries an opt-in or opt-out. Slovenia, do you want to spend 3% on defense or do you want to spend 1% and then you put in 1 to 1.5% in a common pot, collectively pay less, something like that. And then this common European force would have to have a common command structure. The EU does have a command structure. There was this notion of the EU doing all these out-of-area operations and battle groups. So there is an EU general that currently exists. I've met him. We've had him on the show. Very nice gentleman. But maybe you start creating a duplicative command structure. Yes, duplicative. Because you're not sure if you can rely on NATO. Maybe you double hat the people in NATO to be at the EU so that if, it all kicks off, there's at least a general in charge at the EU level. And they, instead of responding to the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, they respond to the European Council. It's actually structurally, it's not all that different. And then people would raise, treaties, you read the European treaties, and I'm telling you, this is legal Swiss cheese. And I talked to someone in Europe that is well-renowned expert on EU law. All of this can be interpreted the way the political masters want it to be interpreted, because there's a lot of language in the treaties about defense that actually create a huge runway. But I think part of what needs to happen is it's really sort of the time for think tanks to throw out new ideas. And this needs to be discussed more. The money part was seen as, you do that and you solve everything. And it's like, no.
But I think you make a good point. We've been so focused on spending on the hardware. Who's operating the hardware on the ground if there is a problem? That's a really important thing to talk about. And understandably so, I think European leaders are also okay, one crisis at a time. There's no time to think about this future where American troops just wouldn't be there or not in as large a number as they are now. So very important ideas to throw out. Yes, there can always be but this, but that, but big ideas. That's also, as you were saying, that's the point of a think tank. And then the European lawyers can figure out what that means. I just have one curiosity question for you, and then we can wrap this up. Is there a world where Europeans, with supposedly all this new money coming in, invest in defense, in the industry for all this armament, while keeping some level interoperability with US systems for the long term? So that it's a separation, not a divorce yet.
Oh, yes. I mean, that's part of NATO's job is to ensure interoperability. And we can operate well with the French, even though the French have tried to design their military technology and their military systems to have as little U.S. content as possible. Where this whole issue of defense technology, though, is a huge problem is a lot of European defense companies haven't done that. Right. So even a plane like the Saab Gripen has a ton of American content. I think it's almost close to 50%. So you have a situation where the U.S. right now could actually stop a lot of European aid to Ukraine because it would say anything going to Ukraine that has U.S. military content, that's not allowed. I hope they don't do that. So that's the dependency issue, right? So constantly the Europeans talking about ITAR, which is the way we regulate and control our defense technology. I'm actually a fan of this sort of form of arms control, and the Europeans don't actually do it well enough, I think, overall. But if we're starting to control what Europeans can do to defend Europe, then I think that's where the real break comes in. So what I think we'll begin to see an increased technological divorce where Europeans will try to build new systems with as little US content as possible. And it used to be they would do that because they wanted to export stuff without having pesky diplomats at the State Department say, no, you can't export to that country. But more because they don't want to have the U.S. be able to potentially not provide them software updates and things like that. You know, a lot of defense tech is like having your iPhone, right? Like you can physically have the iPhone, but if you're not able to update the software, eventually the thing doesn't work as well. And that's true with a lot of defense technology, which is why it's really foundational to a lot of foreign policy and diplomatic relationships. But that is part of the reason why the shock is happening. At the same time, this new money is coming through. And so it really feels like a new era in Europe, and you can sense it both in Brussels and in Paris.
I think that's a great place to leave it and transition over to our conversation with our colleague, Phil Luck.
We are delighted to have Phil Luck join us on the show. He is the director of the CSIS Economics Program and Scholl Chair in International Business. He served in the Biden-Harris administration as the deputy chief economist at the U.S. Department of State. Phil, great to have you here. Maybe we can start by having you outline what is happening right now in the transatlantic trade dimension. There has been a lot of focus on the trade tension between Canada and Mexico and U.S. and China. Right now, it looks like the Europeans are kind of, have their head down a little bit. What is happening? What's the current state of play?
Yeah, being out of the headlines is probably a good thing for most folks these days. The biggest things that are likely affecting the transatlantic relationship in terms of trade policy, in terms of things that have already been sort of announced as potential, are the reciprocal tariff policy the president has suggested, as well as the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Just for those of you who have not thought about reciprocal tariffs before, which is basically everybody.
Real humans.
Yeah, exactly.
But you are not a real human, so we're glad to have you here.
AKA an economist.
Exactly. You can plug us in like Roombas, basically. Basically, a reciprocal tariff says, it sounds nice in principle, but the devil's in the details, whatever tariff rate someone applies on us will apply back to them, right? So having this type of tariff policy is entirely out of accordance with the WTO system. So that's one reason the Euros may not like it. Also, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. So there's about 20,000 HS tariff codes, basically, in the tariff schedule, and there's 193 countries, right? So you're talking about millions upon millions of tariff rates. It also just doesn't accord with, U.S. industrial policy or our partners' industrial policy either. So that would raise tariff rates and basically kick off a minor, if not major, tariff war. Again, the other would be a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. We did this, in the first run around. It caused a lot of issues, led to the negotiations around CBAM and the global arrangement. So we'll see if that happens as well.
One of the issues, I think, with the reciprocal tariffs is the Trump administration is saying that the European value-added tax, the VAT tax that they put on essentially a sales tax, is a tariff. Can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, it's basically a nonsensical claim. So we have tariffs, as do the Europeans. There's, very few goods which there are no taxes on internationally traded goods. But those are taxes where, if there's a widget from the United States, there's a tax imposed. Widget from Belgium, no tax imposed, right? Value-added taxes are not like that. They're just a tax on the consumption of goods. It is not an apples-to-apples comparison to sort of say that. Again, I don't know why this is. It provides the president a sort of like a stronger bargaining point in terms of like, hey, we'll impose a bigger tariff on you, but it's not based in reality in any real way.
And it's also quite high because VAT in Europe in most places is about 20% or something like that. It's not small potatoes.
No, yeah. I mean, the United States does not have a value-added tax, but a lot of countries use it as one of the major bases for tax revenue. So this would be like if the Europeans in negotiations on tariffs were like, well, we're going to call your income tax a tariff, and therefore that's going to be a basis of our negotiation, right? It's just a large source of tax revenue. Again, not really an apples-to-apples comparison.
And we should say also, as much as the United States' biggest direct trading partners are obviously Canada and Mexico, also because of the North American trading area, the transatlantic economy is massive, not just in trading goods, but also in investments. We're talking about trillions of dollars every year. So that's also a point of concern, obviously. A question that keeps coming up for these tariffs from this administration that is clearly on the minds of Europeans as well is what is the purpose? And is there an intent behind these threats? Is the Trump administration trying to alter trading behavior from the European Union?
That is like the million-dollar question for a lot of these threats or proclamations of new trade policy. Again, the intent is not always clear. So the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary in their confirmation hearings both did a really good job of kind of laying out three different arguments this administration is going to use to impose tariffs. The first being revenue generation, the second being, kind of standard industrial policy, trade disputes, sort of the stuff that used to be in bounds. And then leverage, right? Literally what you might call just coercion, right? So let's take those really quickly one by one. It's not a good source of revenue, right? Total revenue from tariffs for the United States is about 1.5, 1.7% of total revenue. Tiny. It's peanuts, right? Back of the envelope calculations tell us that to get enough revenue just to close the budget gap, just how much we're, not paying our bills right now, you would need a tariff rate of above 50% on all goods from all partners. And that's assuming no reduction in trade due to the higher tariffs, no reduction in economic activity, and no retaliation.
Big assumptions.
Yes, big assumptions that would not hold. So it's not a good source of revenue, right? I'd also state that it's a distortive source of revenue. So anytime you have a tax where you have basically two goods that are essentially the same, but you put different taxes on them, you're going to distort economic activity in inefficient ways. And that's what tariffs do. That's one reason economists don't like them. The last reason tariffs are not great is they're actually a regressive tax. Consumers who spend more of their overall income on consumption, as in their basket of spending, will spend more on this tax because this is going to be on consumption goods. Those are lower income individuals. So this is going to be a regressive tax. To the point about sort of normal economic principles in terms of why we would use these tariffs or not, again, that's the thing I think, if we were going to have a conversation about our trade policy versus the Europeans, our AI regulation versus theirs, things like that. That's the sort of playing field I think they're much more comfortable being on. And, so are us traditional economists, right? So far, again, we haven't really focused on the Europeans in that way. We've had these sort of reciprocal tariff ideas and these steel and aluminum tariffs. The third category, which I mentioned, which is sort of like leverage, that's pretty new to this administration. So you now have folks who are at the Council of Economic Advisors and the National Economic Council who have put out writing prior to the administration starting that have basically explicitly talked about using the action or the imposition or the threats of tariffs to get partners to do other things that are not economic in nature, like increase defense spending or change other policies. So which of these tools they're trying to use for what reason is sometimes hard to unpack because they're not always being super clear about what their objectives are.
Right. So maybe we could unpack that a little bit and how Europe might respond here. Because, we did have a trade fight or trade war, depending on how big an argument you want to describe it, in the first Trump term. And the EU responded with tariffs hitting, I think, blue jeans and bourbon and Harley Davidson. As things started to escalate, there was a kind of détente that was reached with a big meeting between the EU Commission President Juncker and with President Trump, and that kind of settled things down. There was a détente. It strikes me that Europe is not Canada in the sense of Canada is so deeply affected, but so is the United States, Canada more so than the US. But the Europeans, I think could weather a trade war pretty effectively. but could also inflict real harm on the United States economically, or, they can also respond in a regulatory way by going after our tech companies even further and just saying, we're not going to allow, Twitter to exist, which they may already do under their current laws, but could respond that way. So how do you see this unfolding? Because it strikes me that both sides have a rather big arsenal to inflict damage on the other.
Yeah, I mean, one argument could be that's why we haven't sort of tried to pick on them yet, because they have more tools to respond. I think it'll be quite interesting. I mean, I think one thing, the Europeans' anti-coercion instrument was sort of created in part because of us from the first Trump term. When I was in Europe, still in my previous capacity at the State Department, but after the election, it was pretty clear that they all thought that we were going to be the first ones they were going to use this instrument against.
And just to be clear, that instrument basically allows Europe to throw haymakers, the economic haymakers.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And again, their telling of it was, the first tariff war or spat or, whatever you want to call it, was sort of the impetus of this thing.
And I should be more specific. Yeah. It's basically if the U.S. tries to pick on one country. So if we went after Denmark and Danish companies because of Greenland, and while it was the idea generated during the Trump administration, it was Chinese action against Lithuania I believe after Trump was gone, that then led to the finalization of the anti-coercion instrument. But it's like your EU Article 5 to defend one member.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So when I was in the administration, we were talking about how good it was that they had this tool to defend off coercion by the PRC. But in every one of those conversations, they were always quick to remind me that it was because of us that they started developing the tools. But you're exactly right. I mean, I think that they can put a lot of pain on us. The other thing I would note is that them using their tools to hurt us will also hurt them in the same way that us using our tools against them hurt us. So there's kind of no winners in these trade wars, right?
Well, on the tech side, you could argue.
Okay, well, I'll say this. The aggregate gains to Americans are negative. I'll put it that way. So no, absolutely. I mean, there can be a lot of pain that can be felt here. And, again, I think that might be why the administration is moving slightly more deliberately with respect to Europe than it has, say, Canada.
What kind of pain are we looking at here on the U.S. side and on the EU side? I'm also wondering if there's sectoral differences in what we're likely to see if there's, let's say, the first round retaliatory tariffs on April 2nd.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the simplest answer is it just entirely depends on what we do, but I can give you a few sort of examples based on what we're talking about. So let's take the steel and aluminum tariffs for a second. So steel and aluminum, we import a decent amount of both, right? But there is a huge amount of production in the United States for both as well. A 25% tariff is a really big tariff. The thing that's really bad about tariffs on things like steel and aluminum is they're inputs to a whole bunch of stuff, right? So it's not just that, steel got a little more expensive. It's everything that uses steel or aluminum gets really expensive. Cars, construction, planes, if you want to build a data center, there's a lot of steel and aluminum in a data center, right? So our other objectives that we have are going to be hampered by this. Industries that intensively use steel, the employment in those industries outnumbers employment in steel 80-1. For every person working in a steel factory, there's 80 people whose jobs rely on buying and using steel. So because of this, if you look at sort of just any historical example, whether it be the first Trump trade war or the Bush administration's use of tariffs on steel in 2002, we lose more jobs in steel supporting industries than usually the entire employment in the steel industry overall. So estimates in 2002, we lost about 200,000 jobs when we imposed steel tariffs. And these were actually fairly narrow compared to the tariffs we're doing now. We lost about 200,000 jobs. At the time, only 180,000 people were employed in steel in total. The problem here, and this is the problem with trade policy in general, whenever you have trade policy that sort of starts to get developed to favor small groups, the benefits of the policy exist, right? They're very concentrated. You have steel unions and steel workers who are for these things. Same thing with aluminum. The costs are huge, but they're diffuse. They're across the whole economy. So it's more difficult to sort of have the political coalition together to sort of balance that out.
How do you see this playing out? Let's just say the U.S. puts in place really strong tariffs against the European Union, counts VAT in its reciprocal tariffs. We're doing steel and aluminum tariffs. How do you imagine the Europeans might hit back? I assume there's sort of war game planning going on. And I know the EU has been thinking about this at the Commission for months. I mean, prior to Trump being elected, there was a cell set up to think about how to respond to the U.S. So how do you see this playing out? Do you think that there will be kind of a flurry of action? It's going to cause pain on both sides. And then everyone's like, okay, that's enough. What's your sort of look into the crystal ball for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think your description of flurry of action and then everyone kind of steps back, that might be the best case scenario got available to us. The first thing I'll say is I don't think we're going to see, the thing I'm pretty confident of is we're not going to see a reciprocal tariff policy as sort of described via tweet actually rolled out, just because that would be so incredibly complicated and difficult to implement and would just cause all sorts of headaches and nightmares. So I can go into more detail on that, but I actually don't think that's going to happen in any real sense. We are probably going to have some sort of like escalation and, threats and deadlines and stuff like that with them. What I would say is, again, I think, look, all these policies are going to be costly. Whether those costs are really concentrated or really diffuse, that's going to determine a little bit of how long these things can stay in place. This is less of a prediction and more of like a plea. What I would say is we shouldn't foreclose the possibility that we can get to a good outcome out of this, right? We're going to break a lot of stuff. We're going to throw off a lot of sparks and stuff's going to happen. But there are a lot of like big problems that we need to try to solve that we do actually need the Europeans for. In the last administration, there was negotiation in order to get rid of these steel and aluminum tariffs again. There was negotiations over what was called the Global Arrangement on Steel and Aluminum, which was the US's idea about how we deal with both carbon, but also non-market policies and practices by steel producers like the PRC. We were basically negotiating on whether we should have some sort of like steel buying club, where if you're in that club and you have clean steel and aluminum, you face lower tariffs with each other, but outside the club, dirty, non-market steel and aluminum is a higher tariff. That didn't really fit with the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism the Europeans had. So we were trying to square the circle. That failed miserably. But the underlying problem still exists. PRC overcapacity and significant subsidization of steel is affecting global markets. And look, we only import about 2% of our steel from PRC, but we're still being impacted from it because it lowers global prices. And we actually have this problem across a lot of industries, whether EVs, semiconductors, solar, critical minerals, right? This is a problem we have. And this is a problem we can't solve unilaterally. We need to solve it with our close partners. So this is not going to be great for the relationship, but let's at least not close off the opportunity to try to solve some of these bigger problems as we're sort of also de-escalating.
Maybe one final question. There's been murmurs, and then now the sounds are growing louder about the role of the euro as a potential replacement to the dollar. Not immediately, but over time, because, Russia and China and everyone have been looking for kind of workarounds to be less dependent on the dollar. Probably the euro is most likely where you have democratic rules-based society that you could put your money, have confidence in getting it back. Now that the Europeans, in particular the Germans, announcing massive investment in defense and infrastructure, the potential for perhaps the EU issuing debt to finance defense, is this something that you're watching out for, that the kind of primacy of the dollar could perhaps be under threat if the United States is not seen as a reliable place for people to put their money, and the Europeans then suddenly begin issuing more debt for international markets to buy? How do you see this playing out? If you outline sort of the best case that we get to a détente, but what happens if we're in kind of a worst case? It's really impacting both sides. We're maybe even sanctioning the Europeans as we did in the first Trump term, maybe supporting the International Criminal Court. So how do you see the kind of international currency aspect here?
First of all, that's a really positive picture there, Max. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, we should all watch this really carefully, regardless of how fast this happens, right? In terms of, the decrease of the role of the dollar in the global financial system. We're moving in that direction. The speed, we can do things to accelerate or decelerate that, but that's absolutely the way things are moving. Two things I would note here is when it comes to the role of the dollar, there's basically two big roles that I think sometimes are conflated, which is the role of the dollar as an exchange currency to basically do transactions, which is, huge right now. The second is as a reserve currency or as a sort of storage of value. Those are related, but not the same thing. The first of those two, basically for transactions, that's eroding faster. The sanctions against Russia, we've seen the number of transactions that are denominated in renminbi and other currencies is growing pretty fast. Add to that digital currencies and crypto and other technologies, the role of the dollar there, it's still by far the biggest, and there's huge network effects, right? Other people trading in that currency just make it better for you to do the same. But we're moving away from that. The other, which is to your point about issuing debt, is an incredibly important point, is the storage of value, having it be sort of where we store our safe assets. The value there is, look, the US government has, knock on wood, always paid its debts, and we issue treasuries, which are by far the safest asset in the world. So there's two things here. One, where does the value of treasuries come from? It comes from the fact that we always pay it back. And there's an enormous, very liquid market for the asset. We have, everything from 1 year to 30-year, T-bills. We do a lot of work to sort of maintain the distribution across those in terms of prices so people can sort of stay in that market and sort of reallocate their investments all within that one safe asset class. And we keep issuing them, right? Because we keep issuing debt. So if you wanted to buy more of these assets, there's always going to be more available. So it's not just that, we issue debt. We do a lot of things in this currency that creates a really safe environment for people. And in addition to sort of saying, hey, we always pay our debts, it's more than that. The key thing here is people need to know that we will be able to pay our debt. Now, that requires basically two things. One, not spending like drunken sailors, which we're not doing a great job of right now. The other is continuing to grow. At the end of the day, your ability to pay back is a function of your ability to continue to increase your income. The US economy has grown in the long run by about 2% per year over the long run, like clockwork for like almost 200 years. So that means we're a pretty safe bet. This is where Europe, I think, maybe has some more headwinds. They are not currently really issuing debt in a way that people can count on continuing to be able to buy this asset to use. And for potentially right or wrong reasons, there's less confidence in the long-term prospects of Europe. I think if they make the right decisions and if we make really bad decisions, that movement can happen faster. But there's still a lot of policy space on both sides to determine how fast that transition goes.
Phil, thanks so much. It's been great to have you on the Eurofile.
Thanks so much. A lot of fun.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Make sure to check out Max's piece, Why It's Time to Reconsider a European Army, for some thought-provoking analysis of how Europe should consider its defense future. Our thanks to our producer, Shannon Young, and to Otto Svensson and Lexi Lenefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.